Thank you very much. Thanks. Thank you. Good morning. Mr. David Gerald, Mr. Daniel Teo, Minister Cheong Tat, it's a great pleasure to be with you this morning. I'm honored to be able to join you in this 25th anniversary and congratulate you on reaching this milestone. I'm not sure who noticed earlier in the minister's remarks, he used my two favorite words, future-proof. Future-proof. And that's a great place to start the conversation this morning. Raise your hand if you believe that we, as a civilization, let's put Singapore aside, we know how special Singapore is, how exceptional we are. Is the world future-proof? Well, here's a map of the human population. When I ask, are we future-proof? I mean us as individuals. There's 8 billion pixels on this map. Everyone in this room, every human being alive is represented here. And I ask you now to look very carefully as I animate this map. This is what's happening with climate change, with climate volatility as temperatures rise. And it's not only, of course, about greenhouse gas emissions, about temperatures. As you know, there's a vast range of complex chain reactions unfolding that are associated with the phenomenon of climate change. And as temperatures rise 1 degree, 2 degree, and higher above the industrial baseline, geographies get divided into those that are more or less suitable for human habitation. If you take this as your point of departure in a conversation about how future-proof we are, you would probably conclude that we have a long way to go. And that's going to be where our conversation will begin this morning. We have a very, very long way to go in becoming more future-proof. Part of the reason is because we still live in a world of mental and bureaucratic silos. We treat issues in isolation, such as, for example, geopolitical conflicts, debt, social unrest, political polarization, and climate, and so forth. We cannot work that way anymore. Complex systems disabuse us of the notion that we can neatly sequence our interventions politically or otherwise. It is like that movie, Everything, Everywhere, All at Once. Other people call it more formally the permacrisis. Most formally, it is simply complexity. And in a complex system, all issues are connected very, very deeply. Sometimes we can only trace the chain reactions in retrospect, but we don't do a good job of predicting them in advance. But we certainly appreciate how connected they are. If you look today at the headlines, you can see clearly that the geopolitical tension, geopolitical conflict in Eurasia, particularly between Russia and Ukraine, is having an impact on energy prices, which is having an impact on the discussions around whether or not we can afford a clean energy transition, and the costs associated with that are exacerbating divides and social rifts within economies, and how fiscal allocation is done. That's just a random sampling. Pick any of these tiles and you can find the connections between them. And that's increasingly how we're going to have to think if we want to get ahead of the complexity of the complex chain reactions. But that said, it's just important to remember that in any complex system, we all become price takers. There is no powerful enough to be standing outside the system. Everyone in some way is both a cause, an agent, but also a victim and reactive. Such is the collective nature of the system we've created. Now, my background is very much in geopolitics, and traditionally, that's an area where we focus primarily on military affairs and strategic tensions, as if, again, it is a realm apart. We treat it like it is something that is superior to, prior to other considerations. But here, too, even this most grave of, again, silos or issues is very much affected by climate. In fact, you could say now that climate is becoming a driver of geopolitics. You can see it playing out in many different ways, upstream and downstream. You can see the economic damage that's being done to societies based on climate catastrophes and natural disasters. You can see the growing competition for water resources and other natural resources around the region, not least our region as well. You can see not only heat stress in particular and the impact that's having on labor productivity. We'll talk more about that briefly. It's even having an impact on demographics. Surveys of young people show that climate consciousness is one of the reasons why fertility is going down. And that in turn, of course, has economic consequences, which of course affects the power of a society. I like to say, actually, in global demographics, that collecting people is collecting power. It's actually been true in geopolitical theory for a long time, but we ignored it at a time when the world population was growing so rapidly. But that's actually not happening anymore, and climate, in fact, is one reason why. And of course, climate is now, can be seen, some would say positively, as a driver of a new industrial arms race, right, amongst nations. And so we're starting to see that the balance of innovation, technologically in semiconductors, but also from a climate perspective in terms of renewable energies, hydrogen, wind, solar, nuclear, and so forth, is a source of national strength as well. So climate is insinuating itself into everything very, very strategically, and geopolitics is not immune. Nothing is immune. So I come back to this very important point just to reiterate that we exist in a highly complex system, and the word complexity is not synonymous with the word complicated. There's a great PowerPoint slide I once saw differentiating the two and said, a toaster is complicated. The global economy and the biosphere are complex. And you can see the difference. You can disassemble a toaster and put it back together again. It's merely a complicated contraption, nothing more. You cannot simply reverse engineer and put back and reset to the pre-industrial revolution the climate, right? The climate tomorrow and the day after tomorrow and the day after that will not look like today, yesterday, the day before, or 1850. Ever. Ever. It is in the exact definition of complexity and a chaotic system that it never reproduces itself. It is always going to follow nonlinear dynamics, have emergent properties, and result in a different future than the past. I like to say, one of our mottos in our company is, the past is a terrible guide to the future. And I think you have to take that to heart if you want to stay ahead of the climate crisis. Now, our climate modeling has been guided by a merely complicated view, the toaster approach to climate economics, you might call it. And this is the famous Nordhaus models, the DICE models, that take more or less linear, quadratic image functions and apply it to GDP, and they came up with fairly manageable forecasts around the impact of climate change on the world economy. Well, it only took a few years for climate change itself to disabuse us of the notions that those were valid approaches to modeling the impact of climate on the world economy. You don't have to have a PhD in econometrics or climate biophysics to simply see what is happening in terms of these nonlinear dynamics. I've given you just a few examples, and it's summed up by this very tart phrase by Ernest Hemingway in his novel The Sun Also Rises. How did you go bankrupt? And the answer is, sir, gradually, then suddenly. And you can see this playing out in even the wealthiest societies in the world. Flooding events, wildfires, droughts, devastating. And these are the rich countries. These are the rich countries. And so you have to take not the notion that we can reset back to the 19th century as your point of departure, but instead view this as an unfolding, very, very dynamic and almost uncontrollable process by us, one to which we must focus more on adaptation as much as we focus on mitigation. And it's the balance between the two that I'll focus on now for a few minutes. But one thing is for sure, we have underestimated the impact. Yes, we have rightly devoted enormous resources to decarbonization efforts, but we must acknowledge that they have been utterly inadequate. 58 gigatons a year of carbon emissions, still going up towards 60, much of that being cumulative, many other sources of emissions from the natural and industrial world still undercounted. All of that is true and cannot be reversed. And then we've underestimated the downstream impact of those realities in terms of the percentage of the world population that is vulnerable, the impact that will have on climate migration, a subject I've studied very, very closely around the world, mispricing of assets, and erosion of GDP. And it leads to a very, very fundamental question. What is the price of tomorrow? Because we have taken very predictable, very linear approaches, very standard static cash flow discounting models and applied to assets when we look into the future. And those functions simply do not apply when you factor in climate to the proper degree that you need to. And it is not peripheral areas of the world economy, but the largest sector of the economy: finance, energy, real estate, land, technology, that are going to be affected. So no, simply metrics, carbon accounting, ESG strategies, disclosures are very, very important. And you are a standard setting body that can have a huge impact on that. But in the physical world, in the geographical world, we cannot pretend that that is enough. We have to focus much more on adaptation, which I argue is not only the best risk mitigation strategy itself, but is also something of an investment proposition. It is the way in which we can generate higher absolute returns. It's actually by thinking about investing in adaptation technologies, solutions, and deployment. Now, this has been recognized, these nonlinear effects. We have lots of reports about them that have been issued. The Bank of International Settlements famously issued its Green Swan report a couple of years ago. Mark Carney, when he was governor of the Central Bank of England, popularized the term, reintroduced the term Minsky moments to apply to climate change. We have reams of literature on this and urging us to invest more in scenario-based analysis, for example, to invest more, certainly, in adaptation technologies. And I want to emphasize again why using the assumptions of the past is inadequate. So much of the world of macro investing in index products looks benchmarks to and looks at GDP in determining asset allocation. Our whole taxonomy ratings around developed markets, emerging markets, frontier markets, and so forth hinges on some of these issues. And yet, it undercounts and underappreciates the impact of climate. I'll give you one very concrete example here. Many people use the data from Swiss Re and other organizations when they're calculating looking at what potential impact climate volatility will have on GDP. And those methodologies actually tend to privilege countries for efforts they may be making or claim to make in the future, such as net zero strategies. Yes, my country will attempt to be net zero by 2050 in this industry and that industry. And so you're actually giving a country a territorial space which has a political geography that has no bearing whatsoever to the actual global climate, giving it credit for something that it has not yet done, even though that geography will still be massively impacted, harmed by climate effects. That's how rudimentary our methodologies are at this point in time. So, sorry to be so harsh about it, but you can see, and what I'm showing you on the right is our internal calculations around the actual GDP impact over time, or the risk to the present GDP forecast, and this can be converted into a discount that you would apply to GDP forecasting based upon the climate physical risk of a country. And this is built from a very much bottom-up perspective. You look at a country's demographic distribution, you look at its industrial base, you look at the different climate hazard profiles of different provinces to each physical climate risk, and you build up the impact that climate volatility will have on GDP. You don't simply say, well, country X has decided it's going to go net zero by 2060, and therefore its GDP will not be as badly harmed as another country. But that's a sign of how far behind we are. So India, South Asian countries in general become a very powerful example of this. You have the world's most populous country, a country that is fast growing today, but already one in which labor productivity, earnings of corporates are being negatively impacted by heat stress and by floods and by droughts. And so it's not something that we should wait to the future to price in. It's something we have to bring in today. Now, as I said, stress testing, scenario planning, greater balancing of climate finance investment across mitigation and adaptation has been called for, but the gap, again, is absolutely yawning. $10 trillion is suggested for annual global climate finance. Of course, I don't even want to say what a tiny fraction of that is currently actually being deployed. And it's underwhelming and insufficient, both on the mitigation side, as I mentioned before, and most certainly on the adaptation side, because most public research and advocacy points out that 95% of climate-related investing is going into the mitigation space. And again, that should be 100 times more. And only 5% is going into adaptation, and that should probably be 1,000 times more. And I'm not sure where the money is going to come from, but I've tried to give a encouraging laundry list of ideas, even if they're not necessarily even politically feasible, such as, for example, levies on key industries, windfall taxes, green subsidies, all great ideas. And even if we did all of them yesterday, everywhere in the world, you would still have the climate effects, the chain reactions, the emergent dynamics that we still have to adapt to and cope with. We cannot pretend that mitigation is a substitute for adaptation. Here's the reason why adaptation does not get nearly as much attention in the global public domain. I go to the COP summits, some of you do as well. I've been following the diplomatic maneuverings and consensus and efforts for a great many years. And it's not a surprise that when international diplomats and gatherings and regulators get together, they focus on the mitigation side. Because global climate mitigation, which is a shorthand for decarbonization, or rather longhand for decarbonization, that's a global public good, one that we should pursue. When you reduce emissions anywhere, you are ultimately reducing the total stock of emissions and therefore attempting to slow the negative effects it has. So we should all rally together and get behind it. Adaptation is not a global public good. Adaptation is a local private good, you might say. When we build a seawall here in Singapore, it does not help the coastal populations of East Africa, does it? And so you should not expect that at a global level, adaptation is going to receive as much attention as mitigation does. Be that as it may, we, each of us, individuals, citizens, live somewhere. We live in a country. Our country must do whatever it can to adapt. We have to invest the necessary resources in our own adaptation and not simply hope that everyone suddenly changes their minds in this global collective action problem and starts to commit the necessary resources to mitigation. And that is what is missing, is the additional investment in the local private adaptation measures that ultimately will make each society more resilient, which ultimately makes the system, our global economy being that system, more resilient. And so we all have an obligation not only to make these local adaptations, but to see the big picture and how it contributes to the big picture. Now, this is also actually from Swiss Re. I like to call this an ounce of adaptation is worth a pound of resilience, also known as the precautionary principle. The precautionary principle is itself the fundamental root of the idea of prudential governance and macroprudential measures. There's a direct line between that very important philosophical, ethical principle of governance and global public policy. And they rightly recommend that we make significant adaptation investments because of the benefit to cost ratio, right? Again, make those investments today, avoid the harm and damage done to your own economy tomorrow by way of retrofits to assets, especially in countries, of course, that are the most vulnerable to climate change. I mentioned India earlier. When you look at the perspective or predicted GDP impact of climate volatility, of course, emerging markets and developing countries are hurt the most. And they have to do the most, therefore, to invest in adaptation. And that involves not only the retrofits to infrastructure assets, but direct support to families. And again, you see this in the news every day when it comes to the impact of typhoons, flooding events, and so forth around the world, again, particularly in poorer countries. So again, Sitting in Singapore, it may be obvious that we can afford to do both, and we do. One of my favorite recent headlines from Bloomberg that I screenshot here is Singapore is fighting rising sea levels to save real estate. But it's the subtitle that says, "The island nation won't cede an inch of land," a government official pledges. In fact, of course, Singapore is so plucky, you might say, that we even want to reclaim yet more land from the sea. So we can consider ourselves fortunate, a government that's incredibly far-sighted, that has the resources to make the necessary adaptation investments. But as with many things in the world, Singapore is unfortunately quite unique. There are 200 countries in the world, and we are literally one of the smallest, and literally the only one, the only lonely country in the world with an actual national adaptation plan. I do this for a living. There are no other countries whose national climate adaptation strategies I would give a passing grade to. And even we may find ourselves, what we've done being potentially inadequate. That's how far behind the world is. I asked at the beginning, are we future-proof? And the answer is not even close. Only Singapore tries to come close. That's how far behind. And we are a global asset allocating country, a global investor, a large one. We will be affected indirectly through the fact that other countries are not as adapted as we are. So I'll move ahead a little bit to a few points on AI, because a complex system simply can't be understood only looking at linear kinds of dynamics. And that was the founding premise of our company, which was founded very much in support with support from the Singapore government, to actually apply AI, an AI toolkit to geospatial data, meaning everything from climate data to infrastructure mapping and so forth, to try to understand in advance how this complex system is going to impact our assets, but to do so, again, in a predictive way. That is known as spatial finance, bringing geography, bringing the environment into our financial analytics. It's at the intersection of climate tech, of fintech, short tech, reg tech, everything tech. But AI is at the heart of that because, again, our past models have been wrong. So it starts with the upstream and downstream applications of AI, actually. The upstream applications are absolutely crucial because climate modeling is itself a very complex enterprise involving thousands of different institutions around the world, each of which makes different forecasts. Those forecasts apply under different time horizons as well, and they apply to different phenomena like flooding, heat waves, droughts, fires, sea level rise, and so forth. So distilling that data, curating that data, geolocating that data, understanding the different scenarios under which it'll play out is step one, and that's hard enough. And a lot of what's known as inferential downscaling that uses natural language processing and the geospatial equivalents of NLP are AI tools that are necessary to do that, to put the climate data on a map with a common resolution so that when you want to understand the impact on a company, on a location, a geography, you can get that data. That involves AI. Downstream, there's the new climate econometrics, you could say, right? What are the actual algorithms, calculations, formulas, equations that we're using to try to understand? Typically, in valuation exercises in real assets, you'll use, again, a standard discount cash flow model, very, very traditional approaches. What we've done is to say, well, depending on what year out in the future you look, there is going to be a lot of volatility in the different climate impacts that are forecasted. It is itself very nonlinear, and therefore the impact on asset values cannot be treated with a simple standard cash flow multiplier, right? It has a much more complex process. So these are just a couple of examples, and that leads to genuinely financially material data sets, such as understanding CapEx costs that relate to insurance premiums. We try to predict what insurance premiums are going to be for different locations in the world. Impacts on other aspects of cash flows, maintenance, energy costs. Heat stress has a huge impact on grids, that cost is passed on, and then that has to go into cash flow models and the profitability of assets, right? So very, very tangible financial metrics can be derived from when you make geographically concrete climate dynamics, and understanding whether or not a location is resilient to climate shocks. What we found is that because we've been using only risk models on climate and basically saying a location is forecast to have significant exposure to drought or heat waves in the future, we presume that there is a linear function between that projected damage and the actual impact. That is a fancy way of saying, actually, that if that were true, no one would live in Singapore. No one would live in Dubai. No one would live in those places if that was actually true. It's not true at all. As Darwin had predicted, it is not the strongest of the species that survive, nor the most intelligent. It is the most adapted. And what hasn't been well measured at all is how adapted a place is. But as I just said, Singapore is quite adapted. So what we do is to not only look at the risk, but also measure the adaptation. And this is, again, a geospatial exercise. You actually have to take all other kinds of data sets and understand whether or not a place has air conditioning, whether it has seawalls, whether it has flood control measures. All of those things actually will offset climate risk. How do you calculate them in? How do you weigh those interventions against the risk to score, to index locations, assets, industries, and entire economies is something that we work very, very hard on in our methodology. And what the result is a map of the world that's quite different from the risk map. The risk map I showed you before was a very grave warning about so much of our habitable Earth turning bright red and seemingly unlivable. But when you factor in the efforts, the adaptation, the things that we can actually control, you come up with a different map. And this is, of course, the God's eye view, the satellite view. But you can drill down to any pixel, to any coordinate in the world. It's known as, the resolution is roughly 200 meters. So basically this hotel, right? Or any property in the world. And try to understand what is the potential future risk in that location. But more importantly, what is it doing about it? What are we doing about it? How are we adapting? And by contrasting the risk profile and the adaptation or lack of adaptation, you have a roadmap. As investors, as asset managers, you have a roadmap. Say, this is now what I know I need to do. Right? It's meant to be empowering, not debilitating. And so we take each and every one of the risks and look at how it will be offset, whether it is through reinforcing an energy grid, whether it is through again, physical interventions such as flood controls and other sorts of things. And there is a score also given to a broader notion of societal resilience, right? Which even gets into areas like what percentage of the population has health insurance coverage? What is the inequality level? What's the vehicular ownership? How many people own their own housing? All of those kinds of things play a role in a complex system in understanding whether or not a place is actually resilient to climate effects and shocks. And we've seen with COVID, we don't need to, this is not high theory. We've just lived through an example, right, of determining which countries, which societies are actually resilient or not. And a lot of places, Bloomberg magazine, again, had just published, I'm not even sure what the reason was that they did, in 2019, a health or pandemic preparedness index. And some of you are laughing because you remember this, and you've seen it as a meme on social media. The countries that ranked highest, I don't want to name names, in that index did not fare very well during COVID, right? They did not. There's what you think you are on paper, and there's how you actually perform when you're tested. And unfortunately, again, treating the world as a linear exercise, as a checklist, is not good enough. You have to deeply understand resilience. And the problem with the entire literature and analysis around COVID and resilience, and I've read a lot of it from the scientific community that rightly emphasized resilience, 2 pandemics. But you know what was missing? Any actual math. I wanted a quantification. Tell me what makes a place resilient to a pandemic. Tell me what. And I never found it, and I still haven't in the COVID literature. And one of the things that motivated me going back 3 years actually to start the company was that I was actually just fed up with the COVID literature on resilience. Resilience is a term that we use all the time. We actually use it the most in child psychology, right? How resilient are your children when they face difficulty in a classroom environment or school? But again, no real metrics, no real math, no real quantification. And so we went out and we've now come up with about 257 different indicators and bucketed them, say, now I will tell you proof positive, mathematically back-tested, what is the meaning of the word resilience. And I'll apply it to a place. And this is going to be the only way you know, at best, if you're lucky, that you're actually resilient. And that's what we set out to do. So I give you just very briefly here some of those buckets that we use. But fundamentally, what resilience is the risk you face minus the adaptation that you undertake. And then you've done your best. If you can offset every potential risk with an adaptation measure, you will inherently be more resilient. And I mentioned before that this becomes not only a defensive mechanism, but an offensive one, right? A vehicle for an opportunity to identify investable assets. Again, retrofits to our infrastructure, better spatial planning. Again, things that Singapore does very well, but the rest of the world does not. And those are ultimately going to be the pathways to systemic resilience. I'm going to wrap up just by pointing out that this has significant applications to public markets. So I'll sum that up just with this slide and I'll explain. When we look at public markets, we look at the leading benchmarks, ETFs and so forth. And what we see is that, of course, these companies aren't necessarily inherently climate-proof or future-proof just because they are listed companies that have made declarations and commitments to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. They are not necessarily invulnerable to the physical climate effects that I've been talking about. Not at all. There's no correlation whatsoever, as it turns out. For a company to be climate-proof, you would literally be looking at whether or not a range of factors that we've put together into our own tracking index, such as dependency on certain metals, oil and gas prices, foreign exchange reserves, a wide range of macro features in a single basket. Month to month, how is their share price performed versus actual climate-related effects? You'd be able to see whether or not they have been impacted by dislocations and disruptions in agriculture, in commodities, and in demand, and a wide variety of other features. And this is not how markets are currently indexing or building indices by factoring in climate. It's tended to be more around, again, ESG-related criteria. We believe that's not good enough. So what we're doing is building our own ETF, you call it hypothetical, of companies that are demonstrating the least vulnerability, the least exposure to unpredictable climate effects. And it leads to differentiated performance in the market versus traditional benchmarks. And so these are just some of the ways in which, when you have gone to the effort to extract climate data, to extract and identify what adaptation and resilience look like, to quantify it, to index it, to put it together into useful, financially material data sets, you can leverage it with a boots-on-the-ground approach, the actual investments that a municipality, that a government, that a society makes to physically reduce its exposure to climate change, but it also becomes a much more robust and reliable financial product. And that, I hope, is something of a virtuous circle that can help us not only get ahead of the volatility, of the complexity of climate change, but also potentially turn it into something that is financially valuable and profitable. And so we like to say that our strategy, or all of our strategy collectively, should be thought of as something of a self-fulfilling prophecy. If we can expand the supply of climate-resilient assets, we are going to increase our loss aversion but also expand the scope of investable opportunities to enhance that resilience itself. So I hope that you will join me in this mission. I certainly join you in yours to make the world a more resilient place through smart, future-proof investing. Thank you very much.
Thank you.